Antony's first-class flight turned into a nightmare when flight attendant Tiffany Blake accused him of identity fraud and ripped his passport apart. The airport erupted in chaos. Security moved in, cameras recorded, passengers whispered. The truth was out there, but was it enough to shake a system built on years of quiet discrimination? Or would this, like so many cases before, be swept under the rug? John F. Kennedy International Airport, 5:45 p.m. Antony Williams pulled his suitcase into the first-class check-in area, squinting slightly as the golden hues of the sunset reflected off the vast glass windows. JFK was always bustling. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers weaved past each other like endless streams converging and diverging. Another flight had just landed, and waves of passengers flooded the baggage claim area. He took a deep breath. For the first time in 4 years, Antony was coming home. The passport in his hand was worn at the edges, yet every page held the imprint of journeys that had shaped him. Flipping through the stamps, his eyes lingered on one, the Heathrow entry mark from the day he first left the U.S. for England. He remembered that day vividly. His mother had held him for a long time before he left. "I believe in you, Antony." Those words had stayed with him through every challenge at Oxford. He hadn't just gone there as a young black student navigating an elite institution. He had carried the weight of his family's hopes and expectations, and he had not let them down. For years later, Antony had graduated with distinction. A boy who had grown up under the scrutiny of a society that doubted him had earned a degree from one of the world's most prestigious universities. But there was a truth few people knew. Antony was more than just an exceptional student. He was the only son of Richard Williams, the CEO of one of America's largest airline corporations. Richard Williams was a name synonymous with power and success in the aviation industry, a man of vision, ruthless in business, but boundlessly devoted to his son. Yet he had never allowed Antony to hide behind his legacy. If you want to prove yourself, you must do it on your own. That was why Antony had never flaunted his lineage. No one at Oxford had known he was the son of a billionaire. To him, worth was not in the name Williams, but in what he had built with his own hands. And today, he was returning, not as the heir to an empire, but as a self-made man, ready to step into the next chapter of his life. He tightened his grip on the suitcase handle and glanced toward the check-in counter. A long journey awaited him, but what he didn't know was that a storm was already waiting on the horizon. Antony pulled his suitcase toward the first-class check-in counter. The line at the business class desk was sparse. Just a few businessmen engaged in hushed conversations, a middle-aged couple, and an impeccably dressed Asian man in a tailored suit. He stepped forward smoothly, placing his passport and ticket on the counter. Behind the glass, the check-in agent, Tiffany Blake, looked up. She was in her early 40s, blonde hair neatly pinned into a high bun, makeup meticulously applied. Every feature of her face carried the practiced professionalism of someone who had worked in customer service for years. But the first thing Antony noticed wasn't her polite airline smile. It was the cold, assessing gaze. She scanned him from head to toe. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Antony recognized that look instantly. He had seen it too many times in classrooms, on the streets, even in certain job interviews. The look of doubt. The look of someone who didn't believe a young black man like him belonged in places reserved for the elite. Tiffany slowly crossed her arms, her voice stretching with thinly veiled condescension. "Are you sure? First class? Not hello? How can I assist you? Not may I see your passport, please? But are you sure?" As if he had wandered into a world that wasn't his to enter. Antony remained composed. Without a word, he nudged his passport and ticket forward. "Yes, this is my ticket." Tiffany didn't take them immediately. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, tilting her chin slightly as if issuing a challenge. "Did you buy it yourself?" Antony didn't answer. He simply met her eyes, steady, unwavering, giving away nothing. Tiffany pursed her lips before finally reaching for the passport. But the moment she flipped to the first page and saw the name Antony Williams, her expression shifted. Antony recognized that smile too. Not the friendly kind. The smirk of someone who had just found an opening, something to exploit. She turned the passport over in her hands, flipping through the pages as if scrutinizing every detail. Anthony Williams, she repeated, drawing out the name with deliberate slowness. Then, she did something he didn't expect. Tiffany looked up again, locking eyes with him, her brow furrowed as if she were weighing something important. The pause stretched too long, uncomfortably long, long enough that a passenger behind Anthony cleared their throat, growing impatient. Tiffany didn't care. Finally, she set the passport down, tilting her head ever so slightly. Her voice lowered, but each word carried an unspoken accusation. I need to verify this. This passport doesn't look quite real. This passport doesn't look quite real. Tiffany's words rang out, cold, sharp, like the slice of a knife. Anthony stared at the woman in front of him. He could see it in her eyes, clear as day. This wasn't about suspicion. It was about wanting to be suspicious. The line behind him stirred. A few passengers exchanged whispers. Some stole glances his way. Others checked their watches, irritated by the delay. Anthony took a slow breath, keeping his voice steady. I am certain my passport is real. You can verify it in the system. Tiffany crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow as if considering something of grave importance. But instead of typing his information into the computer, she simply flipped through the pages, her expression laced with artificial doubt. It does look quite convincing, she mused, her tone condescending, like a teacher pretending to be patient with a failing student. But I've been doing this job for over 20 years. I can tell when something doesn't feel right. She set the passport down on the counter, tapping the cover lightly with one manicured finger. Her icy blue eyes locked onto his. And you know what? This is definitely one of those times. The air around them grew heavier. Anthony could feel the weight of the stairs pressing down on him. He knew this feeling too well, being stopped for no reason when stepping into a high-end store. The wary glances when he walked alone at night. The casual, seemingly harmless questions. Are you sure you belong in this neighborhood? But this wasn't a question. This was an accusation. Anthony stayed calm. His grip on his suitcase tightened, his breath controlled. You can check my passport number in the system. It's valid. Tiffany shrugged. Oh, of course I will. She picked up the passport again. But this time, instead of entering his information, she did something else. She pulled. The sound of ripping paper cut through the air. A stunned silence fell over the check-in counter. For a split second, everything froze. Anthony couldn't believe what he was seeing. He stared at the torn pages, his torn pages, fluttering down onto the counter, then slipping onto the floor. The first page of his passport, the one bearing his name, Anthony Williams, lay in two pieces. Shock rippled through him, but beneath it, something deeper churned. Behind him, someone exhaled sharply. A woman a few feet away gasped, her mouth slightly open. The well-dressed Asian man shook his head, muttering under his breath. But no one said anything. Tiffany smiled, just barely, as if she had done nothing more than toss away an expired receipt. She lifted a shoulder in a mock shrug, her voice dripping with insincere regret. Oh, what a shame. I suppose we can be certain now that it wasn't real after all. A slow heat spread through Anthony's chest. Not the kind that flared into an instant, reckless rage. No, this was something deeper, something raw, a violation, a humiliation. His fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Not because he didn't want to, because he knew. The second he raised his voice, the second his anger showed, they would see him differently. They wouldn't see a young man being wronged. They would see a black man causing trouble at a first-class check-in counter. And he would not let them have that. He took a long breath, forcing himself to stay composed. Slowly, he crouched down, picked up one of the torn pages. His fingertips brushed against the jagged, torn edges, cold and rough. Then, he stood back up and met Tiffany's gaze head-on. You just made a very big mistake. The torn fragments of his passport lay scattered on the floor. Anthony stared at them, feeling as if time had come to a standstill. Jagged, shredded pages. Once proof of his identity, his right to move freely, his dignity. Now reduced to nothing more than scraps beneath his feet. He swallowed hard, forcing his breath to stay even. Not because he wasn't angry, but because he couldn't be angry. Not now. Tiffany Blake crossed her arms, her expression indifferent, as if she had merely completed a routine procedure. She was waiting for him to snap, waiting for him to explode, to yell, to slam his fist on the counter. Anything that would let her call security and say, "See? I knew it. They're always like this." But Antony refused to give her that satisfaction. Slowly, he crouched down, picking up one of the torn pieces. His fingertips brushed against the rough, uneven edge. Cold, sharp. He clenched it in his palm. Then, he lifted his head and met Tiffany's gaze, his eyes like steel. "I want to speak to a senior manager. Now." His voice wasn't loud, but each word carried weight, cutting through the thick silence that had settled over the check-in counter. Tiffany raised an eyebrow, then let out a quiet, mocking laugh. "I am the manager here." There was a challenge in her tone. Antony didn't argue. He simply held her gaze for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and scrolled through his contacts with deliberate calm. Tiffany's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to glimpse the screen. But something in her expression had shifted. She wasn't as sure of herself anymore. The phone rang. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the line connected. Antony? Richard Williams. His father, the CEO of this airline. Antony didn't respond right away. He tightened his grip on the phone, letting the silence linger, long enough for Tiffany to realize he wasn't bluffing. Then, in a voice steady but ice cold, he spoke. "Dad, I'm at JFK. They just tore up my passport." Tiffany froze. The smugness drained from her face. The air around the check-in counter grew thick, suffocating. And then, from the other end of the line, his father's voice, deep and controlled, came through. "Who did it?" The atmosphere at the check-in counter had shifted, thick with tension, charged with something undeniable. Tiffany Blake stood frozen, her eyes darting to the phone in Antony's hand. She couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she didn't need to. The way he stood, calm, controlled, yet razor-sharp, told her everything she needed to know. She had made a mistake, but her real nightmare wasn't Antony. It was the people around them. At first, the surrounding passengers had merely watched, assuming this was just another minor dispute between a staff member and a traveler. But when Tiffany tore the passport, so blatant, so unmistakable, they were no longer silent. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, white hair, elegantly styled, a tailored suit, the kind of woman who had traveled the world, who wasn't easily rattled by small inconveniences. But this was not something she could ignore. Her gaze locked onto Tiffany, sharp with outrage. "I've flown with this airline for 20 years. Is this how you treat your first-class passengers?" Tiffany hesitated, struggling to keep her composure. "Ma'am, I was simply following protocol." "What protocol requires you to tear up a passenger's passport?" The woman cut her off, her voice slicing through the air. Tiffany didn't have an immediate answer. A few feet away, the well-dressed Asian man calmly lifted his phone, hitting record. "This is completely unacceptable," he murmured to the woman beside him. Nearby, a young woman, a freelance journalist, was already typing furiously on her phone while recording. Within seconds, a tweet went live. "First-class check-in at JFK. Staff rips up a black passenger's passport. Openly racist?" Attached was a video. Tiffany's hands tearing the passport, the collective gasp of the witnesses, the horror etched on their faces. Within 15 seconds, the tweet was gaining hundreds of likes and shares. And then from the back of the crowd, a middle-aged man in a crisp white shirt and navy blue tie finally stepped forward. No one had noticed him before. No one knew who he was. But when Tiffany began unraveling, when panic flickered behind her mask of authority, he moved with quiet precision. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I'm an attorney." Silence rippled through the space. "And based on what I just witnessed, you didn't just violate company policy. You may have just committed a crime by destroying a passenger's legal document." Tiffany's entire body went rigid. She looked around, for help, for backup. But there was none. No one stood with her. No one defended her. She took a small step back, lips parting as if to say something, but nothing came out. Anthony had not spoken a word, but he didn't need to. His fury did not need to be voiced, because now the truth was speaking for him. The phone was still in his hand. The line was still open. On the other end, Richard Williams was listening. And after a brief, weighted pause, his voice came through, low, steady, razor sharp. Anthony, who did it? The air around the check-in counter was stretched taut, like a wire pulled too tight, moments away from snapping. Tiffany Blake, once in full control, now stood motionless, her eyes flicking across the crowd that had gathered. Gone were the indifferent glances. Gone were the silent nods of approval. All that remained were raised phones, stares of outrage, whispers of anger and disbelief. Tiffany cleared her throat, desperate to regain authority. She shoved the torn passport aside, planted both hands on the counter, and spoke with forced composure. Everyone calm down. This is just a misunderstanding. We have strict procedures for handling suspected fraudulent documents. A voice rang out from the crowd, sharp, unwavering. It was the elderly woman who had spoken earlier. Does that procedure include ripping up a passenger's passport? Tiffany paled. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat when another figure stepped forward. The attorney. He didn't need to reintroduce himself. The way he stood, the way he looked at her, the way he spoke, everything about him exuded the presence of someone who did not back down. He crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly, his voice calm but edged with steel. Ms. Blake, I have a simple question. Tiffany clenched her fists, struggling to maintain control. I am not obligated to answer. Are you aware that destroying another person's passport is illegal? A ripple of murmurs surged through the crowd. Illegal. Tiffany took a small step back. She hadn't seen this coming. Anthony remained still, watching it all unfold. He looked at Tiffany. He looked at the phone still recording. He looked at the passengers, people who had been strangers just minutes ago, now speaking up for him. This was no longer just about him. What was his next move? Argue with Tiffany? Unnecessary. She had already destroyed herself. File a lawsuit immediately? No rush. That would come later. He needed a move Tiffany wouldn't see coming. Anthony lifted his phone. The crowd fell silent. His decision had been made. Richard Williams was still on the line. He hadn't pushed. He hadn't asked again. He had only left a single question hanging in the air. Who did it? Anthony took a deep breath, then raised his head and looked Tiffany straight in the eye. Dad, the first-class check-in agent just tore up my passport. Tiffany sucked in a sharp breath, her entire body going rigid. She also refused to call a senior manager when I requested one. And that was when Tiffany finally understood. This wasn't just some nameless passenger standing in front of her. This wasn't just some young man she could dismiss. The person Anthony had been calling, the voice on the other end of that phone, was Richard Williams, the CEO of this airline, the man she worked for. Sweat began to bead along Tiffany's temple. Her lips parted, as if to salvage what little control she had left, but the voice on the phone cut through the silence. Deep, cold, precise. Stay there. I'm on my way. 3 seconds. That was all it took, and the entire game changed. Anthony ended the call, slid his phone back into his pocket, and looked Tiffany in the eye. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. And for the first time since this began, Tiffany Blake felt real fear. She was no longer in control. She could no longer command the room. Because in just 15 minutes, she would come face to face with the one man she never saw coming. Richard Williams. The doors to the VIP lounge swung open. A small group emerged from the exclusive first-class section, moving with urgency. But among them, only one man made the entire check-in area feel like it had come to a standstill. Richard Williams. He needed no introduction. His presence alone made it clear. This was not just another passenger. Tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal gray suit fit with effortless precision. Not a single crease, not a trace of haste. The metallic gleam of his watch caught the airport's overhead lighting, but it wasn't flashy, just a carefully chosen detail, like everything else about this man. Richard Williams was not the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. He was not the kind of man who needed to demand respect. He simply commanded it. His gaze swept across the check-in counter. And what did he see? Passengers with their phones raised, their faces tight with anger and disbelief. A check-in agent standing motionless behind the counter, hands clenched, face pale. A middle-aged man in a gray suit, JFK's senior airport executive, adjusting his tie nervously as he trailed behind Richard. And in the center of it all, Anthony Williams. Standing tall, unflinching. Richard stopped. No one dared to speak. Even those still waiting in line could feel it. Something was happening. Not loud, reckless rage. Not an uncontrolled outburst. But a different kind of power. The power of a man who was used to being in control. Richard took a step toward Anthony. There was no need to rush. Every eye followed him. Anthony didn't move. He didn't smile. Didn't exhale in relief. But he also wasn't afraid. He had known his father would come. He had known this would be handled. But Richard Williams was not a man who fixed things first. He had to be sure his son was okay first. "Are you hurt?" His voice was quiet, steady, heavy. It was not just a question about physical harm. It was a question about dignity. Anthony nodded. "I'm fine." That was enough. Richard inhaled slowly, then turned. And that was when Tiffany Blake truly froze. Gone was the smug half-smile. Gone was the mocking tone. Gone was the stance of power she had taken when speaking to Anthony. All that remained was fear. Sweat gathered at her temple, but she tried to steady herself. She glanced toward the senior airport executive beside Richard, as if silently pleading for help. But the man had no words for her, because Richard Williams was now looking at him. His gaze sharp, precise, like the edge of a scalpel. "You're in charge of this area?" The executive flinched slightly, but quickly tried to regain his composure. He cleared his throat. "Yes, Mr. Williams. I'm the regional director for JFK." Richard gave a single nod. "Good." Then a pause. A single beat. "Is she your employee?" The words sliced through the air like a blade. The executive hesitated. He turned to Tiffany, but said nothing. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he didn't know how to give it. Tiffany's breathing grew shallow. She wanted to speak. She wanted to explain. But what could she say? "I didn't know he was your son." That would only make her look worse. "I was just following protocol." The cameras were rolling. No protocol justified tearing up a passenger's passport. "I didn't mean to." The evidence was clear. For the first time in her career, Tiffany Blake had no way out. She could do nothing but stand there, trapped under the weight of Richard Williams' gaze, crushing every excuse before she could even speak it. "Let me tell you exactly what happened." Richard Williams' voice was low, steady, each word sharp and deliberate, like a formal indictment. No one spoke. No one whispered. The air around the check-in counter was suffocating, thick with unbearable tension. The senior airport executive, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, swallowed hard, standing stiffly in place. He wasn't foolish. He knew exactly who was standing in front of him. Not an ordinary passenger. Not just another VIP traveler, but the CEO of one of the largest airline corporations in America. Richard Williams turned his gaze to Tiffany Blake. She was frozen in place. Gone was the smug expression. Gone was the condescending smirk. Gone was the air of superiority she had worn so effortlessly. All that remained was fear. Richard studied her, his stare cutting through every excuse she hadn't yet spoken. Then, slowly, he asked a single question. "Did you tear up my son's passport?" Tiffany inhaled sharply, stumbling over her words. I was just following procedure." His passport appeared suspicious. Suspicious how? Richard cut in, his tone unshaken, leaving her nowhere to escape. Tiffany blinked rapidly, sweat forming at her temple. She had no answer, because there had never been a legitimate reason to question Anthony's passport. And everyone here knew it. Richard exhaled slowly, then issued a command, without even sparing Tiffany another glance. "Check the security footage." The senior executive flinched, then quickly signaled to a staff member nearby. It took only seconds. A large screen flickered to life. And then there was, clear, undeniable, Anthony at the check-in counter, calmly presenting his passport. Tiffany scanning him from head to toe, pausing before curling her lip in disdain. She didn't input his information into the system. She didn't call for a senior manager. Instead, she tore his passport apart, right in front of him. The pages fluttered to the floor. The passengers around them recoiling in shock. And Antony, silent, unwavering, watching it all unfold. No one spoke. The footage spoke for itself. Tiffany's downfall. Tiffany stood motionless. She stared at the screen as if refusing to believe what she was seeing. Her lips trembled, trying to form words, but there were no more words. The evidence was undeniable. She turned to the senior executive, desperation creeping into her voice. "Sir, you believe me, don't you? I was just doing my duty. I didn't." Richard lifted a hand. She fell silent, not because he raised his voice, but because there was nothing left to say. He turned to the senior executive. "I don't need to hear anything else. Fire her. Immediately." His voice was steel. No room for negotiation. The senior executive inhaled sharply, then nodded once. He turned to Tiffany, his voice tight. "Ms. Blake, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. An internal investigation will follow. For now, step away from the check-in counter." Two security personnel stepped forward. Tiffany's eyes widened in panic. "No, I've worked here for over 20 years. You can't do this over one small mistake." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "This was not a small mistake. You destroyed a passenger's legal documents, refused to call a senior manager when requested, and have put my airline at risk of a lawsuit. You're not just losing your job. You'll be facing legal consequences." Tiffany inhaled sharply, her entire body locking in place. Her eyes were filled with desperation, but there was nothing she could do. The security officers stepped closer. One of them spoke, his voice firm but calm. "Ms. Blake, please come with us." Tiffany looked around, searching for a sympathetic face. There was none. No colleagues to defend her. No passengers to take her side. Not even the senior executive who had stood behind her minutes ago. She had no one left. The guards escorted her away. Her steps were unsteady. Her face was pale. And when the door to the back office slammed shut behind her, everyone knew Tiffany Blake was finished. Tiffany Blake was gone. The office door slammed shut behind her. But the story wasn't over. The tension at the check-in counter remained thick, pressing down on the space like a storm about to break. No one spoke. A few passengers still held their phones up, recording. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Richard Williams took a slow breath, as if steadying himself after the confrontation. Then, he turned to the senior airport executive. "Now it's your turn." The man flinched, a shiver running down his spine. He had just watched Tiffany Blake fall. And now it was his turn to face Richard Williams. Richard crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, but his gaze cold as ice. How did someone like Tiffany Blake work here for over 20 years? It took the executive a few seconds to find his voice. I wasn't aware of any prior misconduct, Mr. Williams." Richard gave a slow nod. "You weren't aware?" His voice wasn't raised, but there was a razor-sharp edge to it. "You are the regional director. You oversee the staff here. And yet, someone like Tiffany Blake was allowed to operate unchecked for 2 decades. And you knew nothing." The executive stiffened, his mouth opening, but no words came out. Richard stepped closer. His eyes were piercing, cutting through every empty excuse before they could be spoken. "I want a full report on Tiffany Blake's employment history. I want to know how many complaints were filed against her. I want to know who ignored them." The executive swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I'll..." Within 48 hours. Richard's tone left no room for negotiation. The executive hesitated, then nodded frantically. "Of course. Absolutely." Nearby, a young woman, one of the passengers who had been recording, was already posting on Twitter. The CEO of the airline just arrived to handle the situation personally. The racist employee was fired on the spot. But the bigger question is, how did she keep her job for 20 years without anyone noticing? The tweet went viral almost instantly. Other passengers began posting their own thoughts, their own footage. "I can't believe I witnessed this in real time. Thank God there's video evidence. Otherwise, this would have been buried. How many more Tiffany Blakes are out there in customer service?" Richard Williams understood exactly what was happening. He hadn't come here just to defend his son. He had come here because this was bigger than Anthony. Because there were countless people who had been treated like Anthony, with no one to speak for them. He turned to the group of airline executives standing nearby, their faces tense, their backs rigid. This will not be buried. One of the HR directors blinked rapidly, sweat forming at his temples. Mr. Williams, we can manage the media. No, Richard cut him off. We're not managing anything. We're facing the truth. Silence fell over the group. Richard let his gaze sweep over them before delivering the final blow. I will personally oversee an internal investigation. If there is anyone else in this company engaging in discrimination, they will be held accountable. No one dared to argue. With that settled, Richard finally turned back to Anthony. For the first time, his expression shifted. The sharp edge of a CEO handling a crisis was gone. Now he was simply a father. He stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Anthony's shoulder. You did well. Anthony met his father's gaze and nodded. No further words were needed. They understood each other. A staff member approached the check-in counter, placing a brand new passport on the desk. Anthony picked it up. His name was still there. His visas, his travel stamps intact. Nothing had been erased. Tiffany Blake had torn up a passport, but she could never tear down his dignity. Anthony took a deep breath, grabbed his suitcase, and turned toward security. His flight was still waiting, and the sky was still wide open. 3 days after the JFK incident, the internal investigation had officially begun. At the airline's headquarters, a towering glass building in the heart of New York City, the lights burned through the night. A special task force had been assembled, working around the clock. No stone would be left unturned. Everything had to come to light. Richard Williams sat in the executive conference room, eyes fixed on the large screen displaying an internal report on Tiffany Blake. The numbers and data flashing across the screen made his jaw tighten. Tiffany had worked for over 20 years, yet her official record held only 2 formal complaints. At least 17 passengers had reported her behavior, but none ever received a response. 5 employees had filed reports about her discriminatory actions. Every single one of them had mysteriously disappeared. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. This wasn't just the failure of one individual. This was a system that had allowed it to happen. The conference room doors swung open. A tall black woman stepped inside, her short-cropped hair framing sharp, unwavering eyes. She wore a simple yet professional suit, her presence exuding quiet strength. Camille Harris, a former employee, one of the many who had been forced out after speaking up against Tiffany Blake. Richard studied her for a moment. He remembered Camille. She had once been one of the best flight attendants in the airline. She took a seat across from him, unflinching. Tiffany Blake was never the only problem. Richard nodded. Tell me everything. Camille reached in her bag and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it onto the table with a heavy thud. This is evidence of Tiffany Blake repeatedly denying black passengers boarding privileges, accusing them of using fraudulent documents, or deliberately making their travel experience hell simply because she didn't like how they looked. Richard picked up the folder, flipping through the pages. Internal emails from employees complaining about Tiffany. Passenger reports detailing their mistreatment. Statements from 4 different staff members confirming Tiffany had once denied boarding to a black family, even though they held first-class tickets. His grip on the pages tightened. Why did none of this ever reach me? His voice was ice. Camille let out a short, humorless laugh. Because it was buried. Across the table, the HR director coughed nervously, eyes darting downward. Richard didn't miss it. He pressed both hands onto the table, his gaze locking onto the man. Tell me, who covered this up? The HR director's hand tightened around his pen. Finally, he exhaled and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The regional director at JFK personally ordered the reports to be dismissed. Richard wasn't surprised. He had suspected at the moment he met the man at the airport. What else did he do? The HR director hesitated. Then, after a painful pause, he didn't just cover for Tiffany. He directly pressured Camille into resigning after she filed her complaint. A muscle in Richard's jaw tensed. Across from him, Camille let out a slow breath before speaking. I gave 10 years to this company. Her voice was steady, but there was something unshakably raw beneath it. I thought I'd spend my career here. She met Richard's gaze head on. But the moment I spoke up for a passenger, I was forced out. Silence filled the room. Richard studied her for a long moment before he gave a slow, deliberate nod. I'm sorry. Camille's eyes widened slightly, as if caught off guard. Richard Williams didn't apologize often. He was a leader, a decision maker. But when he made a mistake, he owned it. I should have seen this sooner. Then he straightened, his voice turning to steel. But I guarantee you, I will fix it. Camille held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Richard turned to the HR director, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The JFK regional director. Fire him. Effective immediately. The HR director stiffened but quickly nodded. Yes, sir. Richard continued. I want a full audit of our management. Every single person who buried complaints. I want their names on my desk in 24 hours. Understood, sir. Camille rose, grabbing her bag. But before she reached the door, she hesitated. Mr. Williams? Richard looked up. Camille studied him for a beat. Then, her expression softened just slightly. I never thought I'd say this, but thank you. Richard gave a slight nod. Thank you for speaking up. She offered a small smile, then turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the documents spread across the table. The incident with Anthony had been only the tip of the iceberg, but now he would make sure nothing stayed hidden ever again. Internal Investigation Office, Airline Headquarters. Inside the conference room, the air was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had been uncovered. On the massive screen at the front of the room, files, internal emails, and personnel reports flashed across the display, evidence that had once been systematically buried. Richard Williams sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, his gaze ice-cold as he scanned the senior executive seated before him. Now tell me. His voice was low, deliberate, each word carrying the weight of an indictment. Why did none of this ever reach my desk? No one dared to speak. The HR director shifted uncomfortably, rifling through a stack of documents as if searching for an excuse. But he knew there was nothing left to justify. One of the internal investigators, a sharp-eyed woman with an air of quiet authority, clicked on her microphone. Her voice was calm, but beneath it burned quiet fury. We've recovered deleted internal emails. She clicked a button. These documents confirmed that the regional manager at JFK not only ignored complaints about Tiffany Blake, but directly instructed HR to shut down any report related to discrimination. She tapped the remote. A damning email appeared on the screen. From JFK Regional Manager to HR Department. We don't need to escalate this. Complaints like these only come from difficult passengers. If we start firing people over petty grievances, we won't have anyone left to work. Below, it was a long list of official complaints, all stamped, resolved, despite never being addressed. Others had been erased entirely. Richard's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. With every page, the truth grew uglier. The silenced voices. The investigator continued. We also gathered testimony from former employees. They all confirmed that Tiffany Blake had a long history of discrimination against black passengers. But anyone who spoke up was pressured out. She pressed another button. Audio recordings played through the speakers. A former check-in agent's voice. I saw Tiffany deny a black family's first-class tickets, even though they had all the proper documents. When I tried to intervene, my manager told me to mind my own business unless I wanted to lose my job. A flight attendant's voice. Tiffany once told me, those people don't belong in first class. I reported it. The next month, I was suddenly reassigned to a lower priority route with no explanation. Camille's voice. I tried to speak up, and they pushed me out. I wasn't the only one. Silence swallowed the room. There was nothing left to deny, nothing left to hide. Richard inhaled slowly, then fixed his gaze on the executives. How long have you all let this happen? A senior VP cleared his throat, attempting to salvage the moment. Mr. Williams, We had no idea the situation was this severe. If we had known sooner, we would have. Richard's hand slammed down on the table. The sound cracked through the room like thunder. Everyone flinched. Don't tell me you didn't know. His voice was sharp as a blade. Dozens of reports ignored. Employees forced out. And you expect me to believe no one saw it? No one answered. Because they knew he was right. No more cover UPS. Richard clenched his jaw, then issued his orders. Starting today, every single complaint in our system will be re-examined. Any report that was ignored, I want it handled. He turned to the HR director. Everyone involved in this cover-up. I want a full list on my desk within 24 hours. The HR director, sweating, nodded frantically. Why, yes, sir. Right away. Richard exhaled, steadying himself. He wasn't just here to give orders. He was here to change things. He stood, sweeping his gaze across the room before delivering his final command. From now on, this airline's policies will change. Every employee will undergo anti-discrimination training. Any instance of racial bias or abuse of power, automatic termination. No exceptions. We cannot call ourselves a world-class airline if our employees treat passengers with prejudice. His final words cut through the silence like a verdict. Justice cannot be for one person. It has to be for everyone. 3 days after the JFK incident, the media had turned the scandal into a full-blown storm. From on-the-ground footage and viral social media posts to primetime news segments, every outlet was circling the same question. Was Tiffany Blake just one bad employee, or had an entire system protected her for over 2 decades? Headlines flooded every platform. Airline employee rips up black passenger's passport. Blatant racism? Major airline faces pressure to change after JFK scandal. How many other passengers have suffered in silence? Morning news anchors debated the issue. Experts weighed in. On social media, millions had seen the video of Tiffany Blake tearing up Annie's passport, and the outrage was relentless. The storm had only just begun. Inside the airline's press room, reporters had gathered early, filling every seat. Camera flashes lit up the room. Microphones and recorders were raised high. The tension was suffocating, like a bomb ticking down to detonation. At the center of it all sat Richard Williams. His face was unreadable. He was no stranger to high-pressure press conferences. But today, he knew that empty corporate statements wouldn't be enough. The questions fired the moment he walked in. Mr. Williams, can you guarantee that there will be no more Tiffany Blakes in your companies? Will passengers who were wronged in the past receive any form of restitution? Will anyone in upper management be held accountable for this scandal? Richard raised a hand, signaling for silence. When the noise finally died down, he spoke, his voice steady, deliberate. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future. The room went still. Every eye locked on him. Tiffany Blake has been fired, but this is not just about one person. Our internal investigation has revealed that complaints were ignored for years. This is a failure of the system, and the responsibility falls on us. He let the weight of those words settle over the room. We will not run from that responsibility. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some reporters typed furiously. Others exchanged glances. But no one interrupted. Richard continued. Starting today, we are implementing major changes. Every employee will undergo mandatory anti-discrimination training. A new, transparent complaint system will be put in place to ensure that every report, whether from a passenger or an employee, is properly reviewed. Passengers who previously filed complaints that were ignored will be invited to come forward again to receive fair resolutions. And the managers who were involved in covering up misconduct have been suspended pending investigation. He scanned the room, then delivered his final words like a verdict. We will not just talk. We will act. The public reaction. As soon as the press conference ended, the public response split into 2 distinct camps. Many praised Richard Williams' decisive stance. For once, a CEO isn't dodging accountability. If they actually follow through with these changes, I'd be willing to fly with them again. But skepticism was just as loud. Talk is cheap. Will they really follow through? For years, no one cared about passengers facing discrimination. Is it too little? Too late? The airline's social media pages flooded with comments, both supportive and scathing. Richard Williams knew the public wouldn't trust them overnight, and he didn't blame them. Trust couldn't be earned through promises, only actions. After the storm, back in his office, Richard loosened his tie and sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. A full day of facing the press had drained him, but there was still too much work to do. The door opened, and he stepped in, setting a steaming cup of coffee on the desk. "You need this?" Richard glanced up, then let out a tired smile. "Thank you." Anthony pulled up a chair across from him, arms crossed. "Do you really think this will change things?" Richard was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "Not overnight, but this is the first step." A small smile tugged at Anthony's lips. "Then that's enough." Across the room, the TV replayed clips from the press conference. Richard glanced at his own image on the screen before standing and walking over to the window. Outside, the city stretched endlessly below him. The media storm was far from over. The public would watch, criticize, doubt, attack. The scrutiny wouldn't fade anytime soon. But storms always passed. What mattered was how you rebuilt in their wake. And Richard Williams had no intention of backing down. 3 weeks after the JFK incident, Anthony Williams sat under the bright studio lights, facing Rachel Dawson, a veteran journalist known for her sharp, incisive interviews. The entire nation was watching. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Anthony, do you feel that justice has been served?" Anthony took a moment to consider his answer. Then, with quiet deliberation, he replied, "I think justice isn't something that happens in a single moment. It's a process." Rachel raised an eyebrow, prompting him to elaborate. Tiffany Blake was fired. The managers who covered for her were suspended. The airline is making changes. That's progress. But this was never just about one person or one company. It's bigger than that. Rachel nodded. "What do you mean?" Anthony met the camera's lens head on, his voice calm but unwavering. "At first, I thought this was just my story. But after the incident, I received hundreds of messages from people who had been treated unfairly, people who had no one to stand up for them." He paused for a moment, then continued. "I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone who has ever been silenced. Justice cannot be for just one person." That single sentence would dominate headlines for days. From a recent graduate, Anthony Williams had become the voice of a movement. After the interview, stepping out of the studio, Anthony took a deep breath. He had never expected to become the face of a movement. But now, there was no turning back. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Richard Williams. "I'm proud of you." Anthony smiled. For the first time, it felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. 3 months later, JFK Airport. At the first-class check-in counter, a middle-aged black woman clutched her passport tightly, her heart bracing for a familiar battle. She had been here before. She knew what to expect. But when she stepped forward, the agent behind the counter smiled and said, gently, "Welcome to your first-class flight. Wishing you a wonderful journey." She froze for a moment, caught off guard. Then, slowly, she nodded and walked forward, a quiet smile breaking across her face. It was a small change, but it was real. A sky without limits. High above the clouds, an airplane glided through the endless blue. In first class, Anthony Williams sat by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. His fingers brushed over his new passport, issued after the incident at JFK. He remembered the moment Tiffany Blake had torn the old one apart. But now it no longer mattered, because his dream was still whole, and the sky was still wide open. Beyond one person, the story of Anthony Williams was never just about a single incident. It was about something much larger. Prejudice and injustice exist everywhere, even in the places we expect to be the most professional. In today's world, many people face discrimination in different forms. The most important thing is not to stay silent. If you witness or experience injustice, speak up. Use the tools available, media, law, community, to demand fairness. And if you hold power, use it to create real change. Because justice should never be for just one person. It should be for everyone. Justice was served this time, But how many more victims like Annie go unheard? Stay tuned for more eye-opening stories. Comment your thoughts and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.